Daniel Harlow found her trembling beneath the cedars. The girl's fingers clutched a silver necklace engraved with initials that belonged to his dead sister. 23 years had passed since that name meant anything to anyone but him. Now it hung against a stranger's chest, impossible and accusing. The woods offered no explanation, only the child's silence and the cold certainty that his past had returned, wearing a different face. Daniel's hands shook as he reached toward her, understanding that this single moment would demand he choose between the family that taught him to forget and the truth that never stopped calling his name. Subscribe to discover what the necklace truly means. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy of cedar trees in fractured beams, casting the forest floor in amber light that seemed to pulse with its own fading heartbeat. Daniel Harlow moved through the undergrowth with the practiced quiet of a man who had spent years learning how to disappear into the edges of places, his worn boots finding purchase on roots and stones without conscious thought. He had been checking the trail markers along the property he maintained, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of Asheville that belonged to people whose names appeared on hospital wings and university buildings, people who never looked at him long enough to remember his face. The work suited him perfectly. This life of tending to things in solitude, of fixing what was broken without being asked to explain why it had broken in the first place. He carried a canvas bag over his shoulder filled with tools and wire, his flannel shirt bearing the stains of honest labor, and his mind occupied with the simple mathematics of fence posts and property lines. The air smelled of pine resin and approaching rain, that particular heaviness that settled over the mountains before a storm, and Daniel had been calculating whether he had time to finish the northern boundary before the sky opened when he heard it. A sound so small and strange that his body registered it before his mind could categorize it, a kind of whimpering that seemed both human and not, as though something caught between worlds was trying to remember how to breathe. He stopped walking, his hand instinctively moving to the radio clipped to his belt before he thought better of it, and let his arm fall back to his side. The woods held sound in peculiar ways, bending it around trunks and bouncing it off stone, making it difficult to determine direction or distance, and Daniel stood absolutely still for what felt like several minutes but was likely only seconds, his eyes scanning the dimming forest for movement. The whimpering came again, clearer now, definitely human, definitely young, and definitely terrified. Daniel moved toward it without conscious decision, his legs carrying him off the trail and into the denser growth where the cedar trees grew close together, their low branches creating a kind of natural cathedral that swallowed light and amplified whispers. His heart rate had increased, not from exertion, but from something older, some primal understanding that he was about to witness something that would require action, perhaps difficult action, and that the simple architecture of his carefully constructed life was about to be tested in ways he could not yet imagine. The whimpering resolved into shallow breathing, rapid and panicked, and then he saw her. A small figure huddled against the base of a massive cedar, her knees drawn up to her chest, her face buried in her arms, her entire body shaking with either cold or fear or both. Daniel approached slowly, making his footsteps deliberately audible so as not to startle her further, and as he drew closer, he could see that she was a child, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, wearing clothes that were too fine for the woods, a white cotton dress now stained with dirt and torn at the hem, and shoes that were meant for sidewalks rather than forest trails. Her hair was dark and tangled, caught with small twigs and leaves, and her exposed arms showed scratches from branches, thin red lines against pale skin. Daniel stopped about 6 feet away, unsure of the proper distance to maintain, unsure of what words would carry comfort rather than additional fear, and he lowered himself into a crouch to make himself smaller, less imposing. his voice emerging soft and careful when he finally spoke. He asked if she was hurt, if she could tell him her name, if there was anyone with her, questions that fell into the space between them without immediate answer. The girl's breathing hitched, and she lifted her face slightly, just enough for Daniel to see her eyes, wide and dark and filled with a terror that seemed too large for her small frame to contain. And she shook her head in response to something, though Daniel wasn't certain which question she was answering. He tried again, asking if she was lost, if she could remember how she got here, if she wanted him to help her find her way home. And this time she spoke, her voice so quiet he had to lean forward to hear it, a single word that was both answer and plea. Lost. Daniel felt something shift in his chest, some ancient mechanism of protection clicking into place, and he told her gently that it was okay, that he worked nearby, that he could take her somewhere safe where they could figure out where she belonged. The girl studied him with an intensity that felt disproportionate to her age, as though she were weighing not just his words, but something deeper, something about the shape of his presence, and after a long moment she gave a tiny nod. Daniel extended his hand slowly, palm up, an offering rather than a demand, and when she finally reached out to take it, her fingers were ice cold despite the mild temperature, her grip desperate and clutching. He helped her stand, noticing that she wobbled slightly, unsteady on her feet, and he wondered how long she had been out here, whether she had eaten, whether anyone was looking for her. She came only to his waist, this fragile creature who seemed constructed of equal parts courage and trauma, and as they began walking back toward the trail, Daniel felt her hand tighten around his, felt the way she pressed closer to his side, and he experienced the unfamiliar weight of being needed by someone who had nowhere else to turn. The forest seemed to close in around them as they moved, the light continuing to fade. And Daniel found himself whispering reassurances that he wasn't entirely certain he believed, promises that everything would be all right, that they would find whoever was looking for her, that she was safe now. They emerged from the dense cedar grove onto the main trail, and Daniel guided her toward his truck, parked about a quarter-mile down the path in a small clearing he used for equipment storage. The girl walked beside him in silence, her eyes fixed on the ground, and Daniel noticed for the first time that she was clutching something against her chest with her free hand, something small that caught the fading light. He didn't ask about it immediately, sensing that she needed time to trust him before she would share whatever small treasures or talismans she was protecting. The truck appeared ahead, dusty and practical, and Daniel opened the passenger door, helping her climb onto the seat that was far too large for her small frame. He asked again if she was hurt anywhere, if anything felt broken or particularly painful, and she shook her head. Though her arms were marked with bruises in various stages of healing, purple and yellow and green, fingerprint-sized marks on her upper arms that made Daniel's jaw tighten. He kept his voice steady, refusing to let his sudden anger show, and he told her he was going to take her to the ranger station where there were people who could help find her family. The girl finally looked up at him fully, her eyes meeting his with a directness that was startling, and she whispered something that Daniel almost missed, words that seemed to cost her enormous effort. "They won't look for me the right way." Daniel paused with his hand still on the doorframe, the meaning of her statement settling over him like a shadow, and he asked carefully what she meant by that, what the right way was. But the girl had already retreated back into silence, her gaze dropping to the object she held against her chest. Daniel decided not to push, understanding instinctively that whatever story she carried would emerge in its own time, and he closed the door gently before walking around to the driver's side. As he climbed behind the wheel and started the engine, he glanced over at his small passenger and noticed for the first time what she was holding so tightly. A silver necklace, delicate and clearly expensive, with a pendant that caught the dashboard light. The girl was running her thumb over the surface of the pendant in a repetitive motion that suggested both comfort and obsession, and Daniel felt a strange curiosity about what it said. What words or symbols could provide such solace to a frightened child alone in the woods? He put the truck in gear and began driving slowly down the access road, his mind already moving through the logistics of what came next: how to contact authorities, how to ensure this child received proper care, how to make certain that whoever was responsible for those bruises would be held accountable. The mountains rose around them in darkening silhouettes as they descended toward town, the first drops of rain beginning to spatter against the windshield, and Daniel Harlow had no way of knowing that the necklace clutched in the girl's small hand contained initials that would detonate the careful piece he had spent decades constructing. Initials that belonged to a ghost he had tried and failed to bury. Initials that would force him to excavate a past he had promised himself he would never touch again. The ranger station sat at the edge of town, a modest building constructed of local stone and timber that tried to project authority while remaining welcoming, and Daniel pulled into the parking lot as the rain began falling in earnest. The girl had not spoken during the drive, her attention remaining fixed on the necklace, and Daniel had not pressed her, allowing the silence to exist as a kind of neutral space where neither of them had to explain themselves yet. He parked near the entrance and turned off the engine, the sudden quiet broken only by the drumming of rain on the truck's metal roof, and he looked over at his passenger, trying to find words that would prepare her for what came next. She needed to talk to people who had training for these situations, he explained, people who knew how to find families and make sure children were protected, and while his voice remained gentle, there was an underlying firmness, a sense that this was not negotiable. The girl nodded without looking at him, her fingers still working over the pendant surface, and Daniel felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, a reluctance to hand her over to systems and processes, to authorities who might not see what he saw when he looked at those bruises. He pushed the feeling aside and told her to wait while he came around to help her down, and she obeyed with the stillness of someone accustomed to following instructions, someone who had learned that compliance sometimes meant survival. Inside the station, warmth and fluorescent light created a jarring contrast to the dim forest they had just left, and a young woman in a ranger uniform looked up from her desk with the practiced smile of someone trained to handle the public. Daniel approached with the girl close behind him, her hand finding his again, and he explained in simple terms that he had found her alone in the woods on the Whitmore estate, that she appeared unharmed, aside from some scratches and bruises, that she had not given him a name or explained how she came to be there. The ranger's expression shifted from friendly to professional concern, her eyes moving to the girl with the kind of assessment that came from experience, and she came around the desk, lowering herself to the girl's eye level to ask gentle questions. "What's your name, sweetheart? Do you remember where you live? Can you tell me who takes care of you?" The girl remained silent, her grip on Daniel's hand tightening, and the ranger glanced up at him with a look that suggested this was not unusual, that frightened children often retreated into muteness when faced with authority figures. The ranger stood and gestured toward a more comfortable area, with sofas and a low table covered in coloring books and puzzles, spaces designed to put children at ease, and she asked Daniel to stay while she made some calls, to provide whatever comfort his presence seemed to offer the girl. They sat together on a worn sofa that smelled faintly of coffee and old paperwork. The girl pressed against Daniel's side, as though trying to merge with his shadow, and Daniel found himself studying the station's interior with new eyes, seeing it as she might see it, institutional, impersonal, a place of bureaucracy rather than safety. The ranger was speaking quietly into a phone across the room, her voice low enough that Daniel could only catch fragments. Words like unidentified minor and possible neglect and check missing persons reports, and he felt the girl tense beside him with each phrase. He told her softly that these people would help, that it was their job to make sure she got home safely, and she turned her face up toward him with an expression that carried such profound doubt that Daniel felt his certainty waver. She whispered again, more clearly this time, that they wouldn't look in the right places, that they would take her back to where the hurting happened, and Daniel felt cold understanding begin to seep through his initial assumptions. He asked carefully if someone at home had hurt her, if that's why she ran, and after a long moment the girl nodded, her free hand still clutching the necklace against her chest. Daniel felt anger rise again, sharper this time, and he glanced toward the ranger who was now consulting her computer, presumably searching databases for missing children matching this description. The ranger returned after perhaps 10 minutes that felt much longer, carrying a bottle of water and a granola bar that she offered to the girl, and her expression had shifted again, this time to something more complicated, a mixture of relief and confusion. She addressed Daniel first, explaining that they had found a match. A girl named Anna Whitmore, reported missing from her home approximately 6 hours ago. Family already contacted and on their way to collect her. The name landed in the space between them like a stone dropped into still water, and Daniel repeated it slowly. Whitmore, the same family whose estate he maintained, the same people who paid him to remain invisible and unobtrusive. The ranger continued, her tone carefully neutral, explaining that the Whitmores were prominent in the community, that there had been some concern when Anna disappeared from their property, but that the prevailing theory had been that she simply wandered off, that children sometimes did such things. Daniel looked down at the girl, at Anna, and saw something in her eyes that contradicted the ranger's reassuring words, saw fear that went deeper than the natural anxiety of being lost. He asked quietly if anyone had examined her injuries, if there had been questions about the bruises, and the ranger's expression tightened slightly, professional walls going up as she explained that the family had mentioned Anna could be clumsy, that she had fallen recently, that there was no evidence of anything untoward. Daniel wanted to argue, wanted to point out that fingerprint-shaped bruises did not come from falling, that children who were simply clumsy did not speak about hurt the way Anna spoke about it. But he sensed that such arguments would go nowhere, that the architecture of class and influence had already determined what story would be believed. Anna had begun trembling again beside him, her small body shaking with visible fear, and she pulled the necklace out from where it had been pressed against her chest, holding it up as though it were evidence of something, as though its existence proved a point she lacked words to articulate. Daniel looked at it properly for the first time, the delicate silver chain, the small oval pendant, and the letters engraved on its surface in elegant script, and the world seemed to tilt sideways, reality restructuring itself around the impossible thing he was seeing. The initials read E.H. Simple and clear, and absolutely impossible, because those were his sister's initials, Eleanor Harlow, the sister who had vanished when Daniel was 14 and she was 12. The sister whose disappearance had shattered his family and taught him that the world was a place where children could simply cease to exist without explanation. Daniel's hand moved involuntarily toward the necklace, his fingers not quite touching it, and he heard his own voice asking from what seemed like a great distance where she had gotten this, whose initials these were. And Anna looked at him with eyes that held more knowledge than any 9-year-old should possess, and whispered 3 words that would change everything. She gave it. The ranger was asking questions, her voice registering confusion about what was happening. But Daniel could not focus on her words. His entire being narrowed to the pendant, and the child who held it, and the impossible geometry of past and present colliding. Eleanor had owned a necklace exactly like this, a gift from their grandmother, and it had disappeared with her, included in the list of items she had been wearing the day she vanished from their yard in rural Pennsylvania. Daniel had been inside doing homework, his mother in the kitchen, his father at work, and Eleanor had been playing near the tree line, and then she simply wasn't there anymore. The police had searched, volunteers had combed the woods, dogs had followed trails that ended abruptly as though she had been lifted into the air, and eventually the case had gone cold, another unsolved disappearance, another family destroyed by unanswered questions. Daniel's parents had never recovered, their marriage dissolving within 2 years, his mother retreating into silence and eventually an early death, his father drinking himself into oblivion. Daniel himself had left Pennsylvania as soon as he turned 18, moving south and west, and eventually landing in Asheville, building a life that required nothing from him except physical labor and the ability to remain unnoticed. He had not thought about the necklace in years, had trained himself not to think about any of the details, because thinking led to questions, and questions led nowhere except deeper into pain. Now here it was, hanging from a chain around another child's neck. And Anna was saying that someone had given it to her, and Daniel could not make the pieces fit into any configuration that made sense. He asked Anna who had given it to her, what woman she was talking about, and Anna's response was halting and confused. Something about a lady who visited sometimes, who came when the others were not looking, who told her stories and gave her the necklace and said it would protect her. The ranger was now visibly concerned, clearly wondering if Anna was fabricating stories or if there was genuine cause for alarm, and she was moving toward the phone again, presumably to relay this new information to the Whitmores. Daniel felt protective instinct surge through him, a need to prevent Anna from being returned to whatever situation had produced those bruises. And he stood, his voice carrying more authority than he typically allowed himself, asking the ranger to wait, to let him see the missing person's report, to give him a moment to understand what was happening. The ranger hesitated, protocol warring with the intensity in Daniel's expression, and after a moment she nodded, pulling up the report on her computer and turning the screen so he could read it. The photograph showed Anna, unmistakable even with clean clothes and neat hair, and the report detailed her disappearance from the Whitmore estate that afternoon, listed her parents as Michael and Caroline Whitmore, noted her age as 9, and included a brief medical history that made no mention of injuries or concerns beyond a note about her being emotionally sensitive and prone to imagination. Daniel read the words with growing certainty that something was profoundly wrong, that the official story being constructed around Anna's disappearance and recovery was designed to obscure rather than reveal, and he looked at the necklace again, at the initials that should not exist outside his family's tragedy, and felt the careful boundaries he had maintained around his past beginning to dissolve. The ranger was asking if he knew something relevant, if the necklace meant something to him, and Daniel found himself in the impossible position of trying to explain connections he did not understand, trying to articulate why a piece of jewelry last seen on his sister's body 23 years ago was now in the possession of a frightened child from a wealthy family he worked for but barely knew. Outside, headlights swept across the station windows, expensive and bright, and the ranger glanced out with an expression of relief, announcing that the Whitmores had arrived. And Daniel watched as Anna's entire body went rigid with terror, her hand gripping his so tightly that her nails dug into his skin, and he heard her whisper, "Please," in a voice that contained every kind of desperation. The door opened, bringing with it the sound of rain and the scent of expensive perfume, and a woman stepped inside, who moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, her eyes immediately finding Anna and her expression shifting through relief and irritation, before settling on something colder. Behind her came a man in a tailored coat, and Daniel recognized them both from the estate, though they had never acknowledged his existence beyond the occasional nod. and he understood with crystalline clarity that he was about to make a choice that would either save a child or destroy the fragile piece of his carefully constructed invisibility. Caroline Whitmore moved through the ranger station as though she owned it, her presence filling the modest space with the particular authority that came from generations of wealth and the absolute certainty that systems existed to serve her interests. She was perhaps 45, blonde in the way that required significant maintenance to appear natural, dressed in clothing that managed to suggest both casual elegance and serious money. And her eyes, when they landed on Anna, carried none of the relief a mother should feel upon finding a lost child. Daniel watched the exchange with growing unease, saw how Anna shrank back against him, how her breathing quickened, and how Caroline's first words were not about Anna's well-being, but about the inconvenience of her disappearance. She addressed the ranger with familiar warmth, and thanking her for calling so promptly, apologizing for the trouble, explaining that Anna had a tendency to wander, that they had been frantic with worry, though her tone suggested more annoyance than fear. Michael Whitmore remained near the door, his attention on his phone, apparently only half present to the scene unfolding before him, and Daniel noted the way neither parent moved to embrace their daughter, the way neither dropped to her level or showed physical affection. The ranger was responding with professional courtesy, explaining where Anna had been found, assuring the Whitmores that she appeared unharmed, suggesting perhaps a medical evaluation would be wise given the circumstances. Caroline waved away the suggestion with practiced dismissal, her voice taking on a tone of patient explanation, as though speaking to someone who could not possibly understand the complexities of raising a sensitive child. Anna was fine, she insisted, probably just frightened herself by going too far from the house, prone to dramatics as children sometimes were, and they would of course take her home and ensure she received proper rest. The ranger glanced at Daniel with an expression that suggested she was not entirely convinced, but also not empowered to push back against people like the Whitmores, people whose names appeared on donor lists and whose displeasure could have consequences. Daniel felt Anna's grip tighten further, felt her small body pressed against his leg, and he knew that if he remained silent now, if he allowed the official narrative to proceed unchallenged, he would be complicit in whatever harm came next. His voice emerged rougher than intended when he spoke, asking Caroline directly about the bruises on Anna's arms, about whether those were truly from falls, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Caroline's attention fixed on him for the first time. Her expression cycled through surprise that he had spoken, assessment of whether he posed any threat, and then a cold smile that did not reach her eyes, as she asked who exactly he was and what business this was of his. The ranger intervened quickly, introducing Daniel as the property caretaker who had found Anna, and Caroline's smile shifted into something that might have been gratitude if it had contained any genuine warmth. She thanked Daniel for taking care of her daughter, her words perfectly polite, but carrying an undertone of dismissal, a clear signal that his role in this story had concluded, and his continued presence was unnecessary. Daniel did not move, his hand finding Anna's small shoulder in a gesture that was both protective and defiant, and he asked again about the bruises, about why a 9-year-old would be so terrified of going home if home was safe. The atmosphere crystallized into something dangerous, Michael Whitmore finally looking up from his phone with an expression of irritation, and Caroline's voice took on a harder edge as she explained that Anna had behavioral issues, that she sometimes acted out for attention, that the bruises were from her own clumsiness and tendency towards self-harm when she did not get her way. The words were delivered with such smooth confidence that Daniel could see the ranger accepting them, could see the official story cementing itself, and he felt desperation rising because he knew that once Anna left this building with her parents, any possibility of helping her would evaporate behind the walls of wealth and influence. Anna chose that moment to speak, her voice small but carrying clearly in the suddenly tense silence, and she held up the necklace again, telling her mother that the lady had given it to her, that the lady said it would keep her safe from the hurting. Caroline's reaction was immediate and visceral, her face draining of color before flushing with what looked like rage, and she moved forward quickly, her hand snapping out to grab the necklace. But Anna jerked back, and Daniel's arm came up instinctively to block Caroline's reach. The ranger stepped forward with a firm instruction for everyone to calm down, her training finally overriding her deference to wealth, and she asked Anna gently what lady she meant, who had given her the necklace. Anna looked at Daniel rather than answering the ranger, her eyes locked on his face with an intensity that felt like recognition, and she said something that made no sense whatsoever. She said the lady looked like him. Daniel felt the floor shift beneath him, felt reality bending around this impossible statement, and he heard himself asking what Anna meant, how the lady looked like him. And Anna reached up with her free hand to touch his face, tracing along his cheekbone and jawline as though memorizing his features. And she said the lady had the same eyes, the same sad mouth, the same way of standing like she was trying to disappear. Caroline was demanding that Anna stop telling stories, her voice sharp with something that sounded like panic beneath the anger, and Michael had finally engaged fully, moving closer with an expression that Daniel recognized as dangerous, the look of a man prepared to use his power to end a situation that had exceeded his tolerance. The ranger was speaking into her radio, calling for backup, clearly sensing that this was escalating beyond her ability to manage alone, and Daniel was focused entirely on Anna, on the impossible thing she had said, on the necklace that should not exist. He asked Anna when she had seen this lady, where she had met her, and Anna's response was fragmented and dreamlike. Something about nights when the house was quiet, about a woman who came through her bedroom window, who told her stories about a brother who had loved her, who promised that someone would come who would understand. Daniel's mind was racing through possibilities, trying to find rational explanations, but every explanation shattered against the existence of the necklace, against the initials that belonged to Eleanor, against Anna's description of a woman who looked like him. The only explanation that fit the facts was impossible. That Eleanor had somehow survived, that she had been alive all these years, that she had found Anna and given her the necklace for reasons Daniel could not begin to fathom. Michael Whitmore was demanding that they leave, that Anna come with them immediately, and Caroline had regained her composure enough to speak to the ranger in tones of authoritative patience, explaining that Anna had a rich imagination, that she sometimes confused dreams with reality, that there was no mysterious lady, and the necklace was simply a gift from a relative that Anna was embellishing into fantasy. The ranger looked uncertain, protocol clearly dictating that she release Anna to her parents, but instinct suggesting that something was wrong, and Daniel made a decision that would either prove his salvation or destruction. He told the ranger that the necklace had belonged to his sister, that she had disappeared 23 years ago wearing it, that he could provide documentation and proof, and that until someone explained how it came to be in Anna's possession, he did not believe she should be released into the Whitmore's custody. The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Caroline's mask finally cracked, her voice rising as she accused Daniel of interfering in family matters, of making wild claims to insert himself into situations where he had no place, of being an unstable employee who would absolutely be terminated immediately. Michael added his own threats, mentioning lawyers and lawsuits and consequences for false accusations, and the ranger was clearly overwhelmed, caught between powerful people making contradictory demands. Anna resolved the standoff by doing something completely unexpected. She pulled away from Daniel and walked to the table with the coloring books, retrieving a piece of paper and a crayon. and she began drawing with intense focus while everyone watched in confused silence. Her small hand moved rapidly across the page, creating shapes and lines that gradually resolved into a recognizable form. And when she finished, she walked back to Daniel and handed him the drawing. It showed two figures, clearly meant to be children, a boy and a girl, standing beside a tree. The boy wore a shirt with a symbol on it, and Daniel's breath caught because he recognized that symbol, recognized the specific design of the dragon from his favorite shirt when he was 14, a shirt he had worn constantly that summer before Eleanor disappeared. The girl in the drawing wore the necklace, rendered in careful detail, and above the figures Anna had written in careful letters. "She showed me this picture. She said, 'Tell Daniel she never forgot.'" Daniel stared at the drawing, at the proof that somehow, impossibly, Eleanor had survived, had found Anna, had known that Daniel worked on the Whitmore estate, and he looked up at Caroline and Michael with new understanding, seeing guilt in Caroline's expression, seeing calculation in Michael's, and he knew with absolute certainty that whatever had happened to his sister was somehow connected to these people, that Anna's fear was justified, and that the truth he had avoided for 23 years was about to destroy everything he thought he knew about his past, and force him to choose between the safety of silence and the terrible responsibility of seeking answers that might cost him everything he had left. The ranger station had erupted into controlled chaos within minutes of Anna's drawing revelation. Additional officers arriving to find a situation that defied easy categorization and required levels of authority beyond what the small Asheville outpost typically handled. Daniel stood holding the drawing while Caroline Whitmore made phone calls to lawyers whose names carried weight, and Michael paced with barely contained rage. And Anna sat very still on the sofa, as though making herself as small as possible might allow her to disappear entirely from the scene she had created. The lead ranger, an older woman named Martinez who carried herself with the competence of decades in service, had taken control of the situation with firm efficiency, separating everyone into different areas of the station and beginning the process of taking formal statements. She had looked at the drawing with serious attention, had listened to Daniel's explanation of his sister's disappearance with a focus that suggested she understood she was witnessing something significant, and she had made the decision to hold Anna at the station, pending further investigation, despite the Whitmores' increasingly strident objections. Daniel found himself in a small office with Martinez, the drawing spread on the desk between them, and she was asking him questions in chronological order, building a timeline that stretched back more than 2 decades. He told her about Eleanor, about the summer afternoon when she vanished, about the fruitless search and the investigation that eventually went cold, about the way his family had disintegrated in the aftermath. He described the necklace, its distinctive oval pendant, the way their grandmother's elegant handwriting had looked when she engraved Eleanor's initials, and he explained that it had been listed among Eleanor's effects in the missing persons report. Martinez was taking notes, her expression remaining professionally neutral, but Daniel could see the wheels turning, could see her making connections and formulating theories. She asked if he had maintained contact with the investigators on Eleanor's case, if there had been any developments or leads in the years since, and Daniel admitted that he had not, that he had deliberately severed contact with that entire period of his life, moving far enough away that the past could not easily follow him. Martinez studied him for a long moment, her gaze assessing, and she asked the question that Daniel had been avoiding. Why, he thought, Eleanor, if she had survived, would have waited 23 years to make contact, and why she would have done so through a child rather than approaching him directly. Daniel had no answer that made sense, only theories that sounded absurd when spoken aloud, possibilities involving trauma and fear and circumstances he could not imagine. Martinez stepped out to make calls, leaving Daniel alone with the drawing, and he studied it with the intensity of someone trying to decode a message from beyond death. The details were too specific to be coincidence. The dragon on the shirt, the necklace, even the tree which looked remarkably like the oak that had stood in their yard, and Anna's handwriting, carefully reproducing a message that could only have come from Eleanor. Daniel's mind kept circling back to the central impossibility. If Eleanor had survived whatever had taken her, where had she been for 23 years? Why had she never contacted him, never reached out to their mother before she died, never attempted to come home? And how had her survival become entangled with the Whitmore family, with Anna's bruises and terror? With this elaborate revelation, orchestrated through a 9-year-old child, the connections refused to form a coherent picture, each potential explanation creating more questions, and Daniel felt the familiar ache of grief mixing with something new, something that might have been hope if hope did not feel so dangerous. He heard raised voices from elsewhere in the station, Caroline Whitmore's sharp tones cutting through walls, demanding to speak to supervisors and threatening consequences, and Daniel understood that he had stumbled into something larger than a lost child, something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. Martinez returned with additional officers and a woman introduced as a social worker, and they began asking Daniel more specific questions about his employment with the Whitmores, about his access to the property, about whether he had ever seen anything unusual or concerning. Daniel explained that his work kept him mostly outdoors, maintaining grounds and equipment, that he rarely entered the main house and had minimal contact with the family beyond receiving instructions and payment. He acknowledged that he had occasionally seen Anna from a distance, a small figure watching from windows or playing alone in the yard, but that he had never interacted with her before finding her in the woods. The social worker asked about his impression of the family dynamics, whether he had observed anything that raised concerns, and Daniel hesitated before admitting that the Whitmores had always struck him as cold, that he had never seen them display affection toward Anna or each other, that the house had the feeling of a museum rather than a home. The social worker made notes and exchanged glances with Martinez that suggested these observations aligned with their own concerns, and Martinez revealed that they had contacted state police and were requesting access to Eleanor's original case files, that they were treating Anna's situation as potentially connected to a historical crime. The night deepened outside the station windows, rain continuing to fall in sheets that reduced visibility to almost nothing, and Daniel found himself thinking about Eleanor as she had been at 12, remembering her love of reading and her habit of talking to herself while working through problems, her absolute conviction that fairness mattered even when the world demonstrated otherwise. She had been bright and determined and occasionally stubborn, protective of younger children and fiercely loyal to those she loved, and her disappearance had stolen not just her life but the person Daniel might have become if he had not spent his adolescence haunted by her absence. He had been 14, old enough to feel responsible for failing to protect her, but too young to do anything meaningful about her loss, and the guilt had shaped him as surely as any conscious choice, turning him into someone who avoided attachment and pursued work that required no emotional investment. Now he was being told that she might be alive, that her absence might not have been death, but something else. Something that had kept her hidden for decades, but not destroyed, and he did not know whether to embrace that possibility or guard against it, because the hope itself felt like a betrayal of the grief he had finally learned to carry. Martinez came to collect him again, leading him to a conference room where Anna sat with the social worker, the girl's face pale and exhausted, but her hands still clutching the necklace. Martinez explained that Anna had agreed to tell them more about the lady who visited her, but that she would only do so if Daniel was present. And Daniel took a seat across from the small girl whose fear had somehow intersected with his decades-old tragedy. Anna looked at him with eyes that held too much knowledge, and she began speaking in a voice that was steady despite her obvious fatigue, telling a story that sounded like a fairy tale but carried the weight of truth. She said the lady had first appeared about 6 months ago, coming through the window of Anna's bedroom late at night when the house was dark and quiet, that she had been frightened at first, but the lady had been gentle and sad, and had told her that she understood what it felt like to be hurt by people who were supposed to protect you. Anna described a woman who was thin and careful in her movements, who always wore long sleeves even in summer, who had scars on her wrists that she tried to hide but that Anna had seen anyway. The lady had told her stories about a brother who she missed, who she had not seen since they were children, who worked with trees and soil, and growing things just like Anna's family kept someone who did the same work. Daniel felt tears on his face before he realized he was crying, felt the careful walls he had constructed crumbling under the weight of Anna's words, and he asked through a throat that felt tight whether the lady had ever said her name. Anna shook her head, explaining that the lady said names were dangerous, that there were people who would hurt her if they knew she was still alive, but that she had shown Anna a picture, an old photograph of 2 children that matched the drawing Anna had made. The social worker was asking careful questions about where these visits had taken place, whether Anna had told anyone about them, and Anna explained that she had tried to tell her mother once, but Caroline had become angry, had said Anna was making up stories for attention, had locked her in her room without dinner as punishment for lying. Daniel's hands clenched into fists at this casual revelation of neglect, at the confirmation that Anna's fear was based in repeated harm, and Martinez was making notes with an expression that suggested charges were being formulated. Anna continued, explaining that the lady had given her the necklace 2 weeks ago, had told her to keep it hidden and safe, had said that if anything bad happened, she should run to the woods, and someone would find her who would understand what the necklace meant. The implication was staggering, that Eleanor had somehow orchestrated Anna's rescue, had known or guessed that Daniel would be the one to find her, had used the necklace as a message that would force him to pay attention and ask questions. Martinez was processing this same realization, her questions sharpening as she asked Anna whether the lady had ever mentioned where she lived, how she traveled, whether she came alone or with others. Anna's answers were vague, children's observations that lacked adult context, something about the lady being careful to avoid cameras, about her mentioning a place where people forgot to look, about her saying that sometimes the safest hiding places were the ones in plain sight. Daniel thought about the Whitmore estate, its sprawling grounds and numerous outbuildings, the structures he maintained but rarely entered because they were storage for equipment or old furniture, and he felt a cold certainty settling over him that Eleanor had been close all along, that she had been hiding on the very property where he worked, that their proximity had not been accident but design. He asked Martinez if they could search the estate, if there was legal justification to look for evidence that Eleanor had been there, and Martinez explained that they were working on obtaining warrants, but that the Whitmore's legal team was already creating obstacles, claiming harassment and overreach. Anna was fading visibly, exhaustion claiming her despite her efforts to remain alert, and the social worker suggested they pause, allow her to rest while arrangements were made for her placement. Martinez agreed, making clear that Anna would not be released to the Whitmores, but instead placed in protective custody, pending investigation of the allegations against her parents. Daniel asked if he could see her again, if there was a way for him to maintain contact, and Martinez studied him with an expression that suggested she was weighing risks and determining trustworthiness before nodding slowly. She warned him that his involvement in this case made him both a witness and potentially a target, that the Whitmores were already positioning him as unstable and obsessed, that he should be prepared for his life to become significantly more complicated. Daniel acknowledged this with a weary nod, understanding that the simplicity he had cultivated for decades was now permanently disrupted, that whatever came next would require him to engage with systems and people and emotions he had been avoiding since he was 14 years old. Anna was being led out by the social worker when she turned back to Daniel, her small voice carrying across the room to ask a question that went straight through his carefully maintained defenses. She asked if he thought the lady was safe, if the bad people had found her, if Daniel would help make sure she was okay. Daniel promised he would try, promised he would do everything possible to find Eleanor and ensure she was protected, and Anna nodded with the solemnity of someone who understood that adults often failed to keep their promises but appreciated the effort regardless. The door closed behind her, leaving Daniel alone with Martinez and the drawing and the necklace that represented the impossible resurrection of hope. And he understood with crystalline clarity that his life had just divided into before and after this moment, that he could no longer be the invisible man who tended other people's gardens, and that the choice to pursue the truth about his sister would require him to become someone he had deliberately avoided becoming for more than half his life. Someone who fought back against power and demanded answers regardless of the cost. Morning came, with the kind of pale light that suggested the rain had passed but left the world waterlogged and grey, and Daniel had not slept, instead spending the night in his small rental cottage on the outskirts of Asheville, reviewing every memory he had of Eleanor and trying to construct a narrative that explained her survival and 23-year absence. The police had kept the necklace as evidence, but had given him copies of the drawing and Anna's statements, and he had spread these across his kitchen table alongside the few items he still possessed from his childhood. A photograph of him and Eleanor taken the summer before she disappeared, a letter she had written him from summer camp 2 years earlier, her report card from 6th grade that his mother had saved. In the photograph, Eleanor smiled with the unself-conscious joy of someone who had not yet learned that the world contained genuine danger, her arm around Daniel's shoulders, and he could see the necklace around her neck, visible above the collar of her shirt. He had stared at that image for hours, trying to reconcile the 12-year-old sister he remembered with the woman Anna described, trying to imagine what experiences could transform a child into someone who lived in hiding and communicated through cryptic messages delivered by frightened 9-year-olds. Martinez had called near dawn with updates, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had also worked through the night. The state police had retrieved Eleanor's case file and were reviewing it for any connections to Asheville or the Whitmore family, and they had discovered something in the original investigation notes that had been overlooked or dismissed at the time. A witness who had reported seeing a black sedan with Virginia plates near their Pennsylvania neighborhood on the day Eleanor disappeared. A detail that had gone nowhere because the partial plate number had not matched any vehicles associated with known suspects. Martinez explained that the Whitmores maintained a house in Virginia, that Michael Whitmore's father had been alive in the year 2002 and had lived in that house, and that they were now working to establish whether there had been any connection between the Whitmore family and Pennsylvania 23 years ago. Daniel listened to this information with a growing sense of dread, understanding that whatever had happened to Eleanor was not random abduction by a stranger, but something more deliberate, something that involved people with resources and the ability to keep secrets for decades. Martinez warned him again about making his own investigations, about approaching the Whitmores or attempting to access their property, reminding him that he was a civilian without authority and that interference could compromise any criminal case they might be building. Daniel agreed to her stipulations with full awareness that he had no intention of remaining passive while bureaucracy moved at its measured pace, and as soon as the call ended, he began planning his return to the Whitmore estate. He knew the property intimately from years of maintenance work, knew which areas had camera coverage and which did not, knew where the old structures stood that were rarely visited or inspected, and he understood that if Eleanor had been hiding there, she would have chosen locations that offered both shelter and obscurity. The estate sprawled across 40 acres of heavily wooded land, the main house occupying only a small portion, while the remainder contained gardens, a pool house, a separate garage structure that had once been stables, and several storage buildings that held equipment and furniture from various renovations. Daniel had keys to all the outbuildings, had codes for the basic security system that the Whitmores rarely activated during daytime hours, and he calculated that he could conduct a thorough search of the peripheral structures before anyone noticed his presence. The risk was significant. He could be arrested for trespassing now that his employment was certainly terminated, but the possibility that Eleanor was still somewhere on that property, still in danger, overrode his usual caution. He arrived at the estate mid-morning, parking his truck on a service road that provided access to the rear of the property, and he moved through the familiar grounds with purpose, starting with the structures farthest from the main house. The old stable had been converted to garage space for the Whitmores' collection of vintage cars, and Daniel searched methodically through the spaces between vehicles, looking for any sign that someone had been living there, finding nothing except dust and the smell of expensive machinery. The pool house was similarly empty, its furniture covered with sheets for the winter, and Daniel was beginning to question his theory when he reached the third outbuilding, a long shed that held landscaping equipment and supplies. Something about it felt different immediately, a subtle wrongness that he could not initially identify, and then he noticed that the dust on the floor had been disturbed recently, that there were footprints smaller than his own, leading toward the back corner where an old tarp covered what should have been a pile of unused pots and soil bags. Daniel approached slowly, his heart rate increasing, and he pulled back the tarp to reveal something that did not belong in a garden shed. A sleeping bag, a battery-powered lantern, a plastic crate containing canned food and bottled water, and a cardboard box filled with items that made his breath catch. The box contained photographs, dozens of them, some old and yellowed, others more recent, and Daniel recognized himself in many of them. Pictures taken from a distance showing him working on the property, photographs that had clearly been shot through windows or from hidden positions, evidence that someone had been watching him for months or longer. There were also older photographs, images of him as a teenager that he did not remember being taken, and pictures of his mother and father from before the divorce. And he understood, with overwhelming certainty, that Eleanor had collected these images, had been keeping track of him even while remaining hidden, had been close enough to document his life while never revealing herself. Beneath the photographs, he found notebooks, their pages filled with handwriting he recognized despite the decades that had passed. Eleanor's distinctive script that had always been neat and carefully controlled, and he opened the first notebook with hands that shook. The entries were dated, beginning approximately 8 months ago, and they documented Eleanor's observations of the Whitmore household with the detailed attention of someone conducting surveillance. She had written about Anna's isolation, about the girl's visible fear of her parents, about the bruises and the locked doors and the meals withheld as punishment, and she had clearly been planning some kind of intervention, some way to help Anna escape a situation that Eleanor described as too familiar, too much like how it began for me. Daniel read faster, skipping ahead through the notebooks to find entries that explained Eleanor's own story, and he found one dated 6 months earlier that laid out the basic narrative in stark terms. Eleanor had been taken from their yard by someone working for Richard Whitmore, Michael's father, abducted as part of what she described as a collection that Richard maintained on his Virginia property, a hidden compound where several children had been held over the years. She had been kept there from age 12 to 28, 16 years of captivity that she described in clinical terms that suggested she had learned to compartmentalize trauma as a survival mechanism. Richard Whitmore had died 3 years ago, and in the chaos following his death, Eleanor had managed to escape, had hidden for a year before tracking down her brother based on the last name and the general region where he had moved, had eventually found him working on Michael Whitmore's property, and realized the terrible irony that she had fled from one Whitmore property only to discover her brother employed on another. She had been watching, gathering evidence of Michael's treatment of Anna, planning a way to both help the girl and reveal the truth about the Whitmore family without exposing herself to recapture. She had known that approaching Daniel directly would require explanations she was not yet capable of providing, so instead, she had worked through Anna, giving the girl the necklace and encouraging her to run on a day when she knew Daniel would be working the northern property line where he would find her. Daniel closed the notebook and looked around the shed with new understanding, seeing it as Eleanor had seen it, as temporary shelter in a long campaign to right terrible wrongs and reclaim stolen years. The notebooks described Michael Whitmore as complicit in his father's crimes, someone who had known about the compound and the children held there, who had inherited the family's darkest secrets along with its wealth. And Eleanor had been gathering evidence to prove this, photographs and documents that she had been stealing from the main house during her nighttime visits. The box contained a thick folder of printed emails and financial records that Daniel did not take time to examine fully, understanding that this evidence needed to reach authorities rather than being compromised by his handling. He was preparing to contact Martinez when he heard footsteps approaching the shed, multiple people moving quickly, and he barely had time to register danger before the door burst open and Michael Whitmore entered, flanked by 2 men who carried themselves with the posture of security professionals, or worse. Michael's expression held none of the careful neutrality from the ranger station, revealing instead cold fury and something that might have been fear. And his voice when he spoke was tight with controlled rage, demanding to know what Daniel thought he was doing, trespassing on private property and interfering in family matters. Daniel stood slowly, positioning himself between Michael and the box of evidence, and he stated clearly that he was collecting items belonging to his sister, that he had found proof Eleanor had been held by Michael's father, and that the authorities were already involved and aware of the situation. Michael laughed, a sound without humor, and he explained as though speaking to a child that Daniel had no idea what he was dealing with, that the Whitmore family had resources and connections that made local police irrelevant, that any evidence Daniel thought he had found could be explained as the delusions of a troubled employee obsessed with a tragic past. The men with Michael moved closer, their intention clear, and Daniel calculated distances and exits while keeping his voice steady, asking Michael where Eleanor was now, whether she was safe, whether Michael knew his father had been a monster and had chosen to protect that legacy rather than his victims. Michael's mask cracked further, revealing genuine anxiety beneath the arrogance, and he admitted that he did not know where Eleanor was currently, that she had been moving between locations, that Anna's rescue had forced their hand before they were prepared, and that if Daniel had any concern for his sister's well-being, he would cooperate in helping them find her, before she could spread lies that would destroy his family's reputation. The word lies ignited something in Daniel that had been dormant for decades, and he responded with an intensity that surprised even himself, stating that Eleanor had spent 16 years as a prisoner because of Michael's family, that Anna had been hurt and terrorized by Michael and Caroline. That reputation meant nothing compared to the actual crimes that had been committed, and that he would rather die than help them silence victims. Michael's response was to signal his men forward, and the situation collapsed into violence that Daniel was utterly unprepared for. trained security against a middle-aged caretaker whose only advantage was desperation. He managed to grab the box of evidence before being tackled, protecting it with his body as blows landed. And he heard himself shouting for help that would not come because they were isolated at the far edge of a property owned by the people attacking him. The beating was brief but thorough. Professional violence designed to incapacitate without leaving marks that would support claims of assault, and Daniel felt ribs crack before he was finally released to collapse against the shed wall. Michael stood over him, breathing hard, and he delivered an ultimatum with the cold certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Daniel would forget everything he had found, would leave town immediately, would never speak to Anna or anyone else about these ridiculous accusations, and in exchange, Michael would ensure no charges were filed for trespassing and theft. The alternative, Michael explained, was that evidence would be planted in Daniel's cottage, accusations made about his relationship with Anna, his life systematically destroyed using resources Daniel could not hope to match. Daniel looked up at Michael through swelling eyes and tasted blood, and he gave his answer not with words, but by gripping the box tighter, making clear that no threat would make him cooperate in covering up his sister's suffering. Michael stared at him with an expression that combined disbelief and grudging respect, and then he simply nodded to his men, and they seized the box, prying Daniel's fingers loose despite his resistance, and they carried it from the shed while Michael delivered a final warning that Daniel was now an enemy of the Whitmore family and would be treated accordingly. They left him there in the shed that had been Eleanor's hiding place, his body damaged and his hands empty of evidence, and Daniel lay still for a long time after their footsteps faded, listening to his labored breathing and feeling the weight of failure settle over him like a physical thing. He had found proof of his sister's survival and lost it in a single morning, had confirmed that powerful people were actively working to bury the truth, and he understood, with terrible clarity, that the choice before him was no longer about pursuing justice through proper channels, but about deciding how far he was willing to go outside those channels, about whether protecting Eleanor and Anna was worth becoming someone who operated beyond the law, about whether he could live with himself if he walked away now knowing what he knew. His phone was still in his pocket, miraculously intact, and after a time he managed to pull it out and call Martinez, his voice rough as he explained what had happened and where he was, and she responded with controlled urgency that she was sending officers immediately and that he should not move or touch anything else. Daniel ended the call and closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his lids he saw Eleanor at 12, smiling in that photograph, and he made a promise to that memory that he would not stop until she was safe, and the people who had stolen her childhood were held accountable, regardless of what that promise cost him. Daniel woke in a hospital room with broken ribs and the bitter taste of failure on his tongue, knowing that Michael Whitmore's men had beaten him and stolen the evidence he had found in Eleanor's hiding place. The notebooks, photographs, and documents that proved his sister's 16-year captivity and the Whitmore family's crimes had vanished, taken by professionals who left no trace except the bruises covering Daniel's torso. Detective Martinez and a specialist in organized crime named Wilson took his statement multiple times, building a case they knew would face fierce legal resistance from people who could afford to make problems disappear. They told him that Eleanor's DNA had been found in the shed, that Anna's testimony was consistent and credible, but that without the physical evidence Daniel had discovered, proving the larger conspiracy involving Richard Whitmore's compound and network would be monumentally difficult. Daniel listened to their careful words and understood that Eleanor remained in danger, that the Whitmores viewed her as an existential threat worth eliminating, and that his own choices in the coming hours might determine whether his sister survived or disappeared again, this time permanently. He left the hospital against medical advice and returned to his cottage to find it ransacked, his small sanctuary violated by people searching for anything that might connect him to Eleanor or provide leverage against the investigation. His belongings were scattered with the thoroughness of professionals, every drawer emptied and every surface examined. And Daniel felt the violation layer onto his physical injuries, like additional weight pressing him toward submission. But the violation clarified something essential in his thinking, burned away the last remnants of his carefully maintained invisibility, and replaced it with focused determination that surprised him with its intensity. He understood that the Whitmores expected him to retreat, expected the beating and intimidation to make him compliant, and he decided in that moment that he would do the opposite, would pursue Eleanor with whatever resources he possessed, would trust his knowledge of how survivors thought and where they hid when systems failed them. He thought about Eleanor's notebooks mentioning that hiding in plain sight worked best, that people rarely noticed what they were not looking for, and he began mapping Asheville's forgotten spaces in his mind, searching for locations that offered both shelter and obscurity within sight of the Whitmore estate. The old riverside development came to him like a memory surfacing from dark water, an abandoned housing project he had passed hundreds of times without truly seeing, structures that existed in the liminal space between demolition and occupation. Daniel waited for darkness and slipped away from the police protection assigned to watch his cottage, driving without headlights until distance made discovery unlikely, moving through familiar territory with the confidence of someone who had spent decades learning how to disappear into landscapes. The riverside buildings rose against the night sky like monuments to failed ambition, and Daniel searched them methodically until he found one that showed signs of deliberate concealment, windows carefully covered to prevent light leakage. And he knew with certainty that Eleanor was inside before he ever opened the modified door at the rear. He found her hiding place filled with evidence she had been gathering for months, photographs documenting his life, taken from distances that proved she had been watching him, protecting him without revealing herself, and notebooks that detailed not just the Whitmore family's crimes, but an entire network of wealthy men who had participated in Richard Whitmore's operation and protected each other through mutual complicity and shared guilt. Eleanor emerged from shadows like a ghost, learning to be solid again, thin and wary, and carrying trauma in every careful movement. And when Daniel saw her face for the first time in 23 years, he witnessed what survival had cost her in the lines around her eyes and the defensive posture of someone who had learned that trust meant danger. She asked how he had found her, whether he was alone, whether the people hunting her had followed him, and her voice carried the controlled panic of someone always calculating escape routes and measuring threats. Daniel told her that he knew what had happened, that he had found Anna and the necklace, that he understood she had been Richard Whitmore's prisoner for 16 years and had spent the 3 years since escaping trying to build evidence that would destroy the network that had stolen her childhood. Eleanor studied him with an intensity that felt like she was trying to reconcile memory with reality, trying to see her 14-year-old brother in this damaged, middle-aged man who had somehow tracked her to this hiding place. And Daniel saw the moment when she decided to trust him, saw her defensive walls crack just enough to let him approach. They stood together in that abandoned building, and Eleanor told him everything. The full scope of Richard Whitmore's operation, and the network of wealthy men who had traded access to victims and protected each other for decades. The evidence she had been gathering across multiple locations because she was too paranoid to keep it all in one place. The digital files encrypted and hidden that documented crimes spanning years and states. She explained that she had given Anna the necklace, knowing that Daniel would be the one to find the girl, that she had orchestrated the entire rescue because Anna's situation was too familiar and too urgent to ignore, even though it meant exposing herself before she was ready. Daniel listened to his sister's voice, describing horrors he could barely process, and he understood that Eleanor had transformed her victimhood into a mission, had spent her freedom fighting rather than healing, had chosen to become a weapon against the people who had tried to destroy her. He asked what she needed from him, and Eleanor told him the truth, that she could provide evidence to destroy the Whitmores, but doing so would require her to come forward publicly, to endure cross-examination and media scrutiny, to relive her captivity in open court, while defense attorneys attempted to dismantle her credibility and portray her as damaged goods seeking attention or revenge. Daniel called Detective Martinez and arranged a meeting at a secure location where federal agents could take Eleanor into protective custody and begin the formal process of building cases against not just the Whitmores, but the entire network she had discovered. Eleanor showed him photographs and documents and testimony from 2 other women she had located, who had also escaped Richard's compound and been living under assumed identities, terrified but willing to come forward if given protection, and the promise that their voices might prevent future victims from experiencing the same destruction. The evidence was comprehensive and damning, built through years of patient investigation by someone who understood that survival meant being thorough and that justice required documentation that could withstand legal scrutiny. Martinez arrived with Wilson and federal agents who assured Eleanor that she would be protected, that her testimony would be the foundation of cases that would dismantle an operation that had functioned in shadows for decades, and Eleanor looked to Daniel before agreeing to go with them, asking without words whether he would stay beside her through whatever came next. The federal building in Asheville became their temporary world, as Eleanor provided testimony to prosecutors, building multiple interconnected cases, walking lawyers through decades of abuse with a precision that suggested she had been preparing for this moment since the day she escaped. Daniel remained with her throughout, allowed by authorities to be present during breaks as both support and witness to her courage, and he watched his sister transform from frightened fugitive into something harder and clearer, someone who had decided that speaking truth carried its own form of power that no amount of intimidation could fully suppress. Enna was brought to see Eleanor under controlled circumstances, and the girl ran to the woman who had saved her, throwing her arms around Eleanor with desperate gratitude. And Daniel witnessed the connection between 2 people who understood fear and survival in ways that required no explanation. The Whitmores were arrested on charges ranging from child abuse to conspiracy in Richard's crimes, and their expensive lawyers immediately began constructing defenses that blamed everything on Richard, while portraying Michael and Caroline as victims of his manipulation. But Eleanor's testimony systematically destroyed these narratives with documentation and corroboration that made their theories increasingly implausible. The preliminary hearings felt like validation, despite being only the beginning of a much longer process, the judge ruling that all charges would proceed to trial based on substantial and credible evidence, and Daniel sat in the courtroom gallery watching Eleanor testify with a composure that seemed impossible given what she was being asked to describe. The Whitmores' attorneys attempted to establish that Eleanor was confused or motivated by revenge, but her calm precision in answering each insinuation made their theories collapse under the weight of physical evidence and corroborated testimony. When asked why she had never come forward sooner, why she had waited 3 years after escaping to begin gathering evidence, Eleanor's response cut through the courtroom noise with devastating simplicity. She explained that those 3 years had been spent learning to believe she deserved justice, that captivity had taught her she was worthless and disposable, and that recovery was not linear but a daily choice to believe that her pain mattered enough to fight for accountability. The ruling that the Whitmores would remain in custody without bail felt like the first genuine victory in a war that would continue for months, if not years. And Daniel found Eleanor afterward in a private room where she sat with visible exhaustion, the performance of testimony having drained something essential from her reserves, but also having given her something back. A sense of agency and voice that had been stolen decades earlier. Eleanor asked Daniel about his own life, about what he would do once the trials concluded and attention faded, whether he had plans beyond the maintenance work that had sustained him through decades of careful invisibility. Daniel admitted he had not thought beyond ensuring her safety, that his old life had become impossible to return to, that he could not go back to emotional isolation after everything that had happened and everything he had discovered about his capacity for courage when courage was required. Eleanor suggested tentatively that perhaps they could figure out what came next together, that after 23 years of separation, they might try building a relationship that included regular contact and mutual support. That family could mean something again if they chose to make it mean something rather than simply sharing genetic material and traumatic history. Daniel felt hope at this suggestion, fragile but real, and he agreed that he would like to try, that he had spent long enough avoiding connection and might be ready to risk the vulnerability that genuine relationship required, that he was tired of being invisible, and wanted to learn how to exist in ways that mattered beyond completing assigned tasks and collecting paychecks. Anna's future had been determined through careful collaboration between child services and prosecutors who understood that her recovery required stability and specialized care, and the decision was made to place her with foster parents who had experience with children who had survived abuse and knew the patient work of rebuilding trust and safety. Eleanor had been allowed input in this decision, and she had met with Anna's prospective foster family to ensure they understood the girl's specific needs and the critical importance of maintaining connection with the people who had helped her escape the Whitmore household. Anna herself demonstrated remarkable resilience, the kind of adaptability that children sometimes possess in greater measure than adults, and the therapists working with her reported that she was beginning to speak about her experiences in ways that suggested healing was possible if properly supported over time. Daniel visited Anna regularly, bringing art supplies and books that Eleanor recommended, sitting with her while she drew pictures that processed trauma through symbol and color, and he promised the girl that he and Eleanor would remain in her life, that adults could be trusted to keep their commitments even when circumstances became difficult. The trials themselves would take months or years to fully resolve. Multiple defendants across multiple jurisdictions, all facing varying charges, but momentum had shifted irreversibly toward accountability, and each day brought new revelations, as other victims found courage to come forward and investigators located evidence that had been hidden for decades. Daniel watched this unfolding from a position both central and peripheral, his role as Eleanor's brother making him relevant to media coverage, while his preference for privacy kept him largely in the background where he felt most comfortable. He gave several interviews to journalists writing investigative pieces about the Whitmore network and was surprised by responses from readers. Messages from other survivors and family members of missing children who thanked him for believing Eleanor, who expressed hope that maybe their own cases might be reopened, who saw in this story a suggestion that some mysteries could be solved and some wrongs addressed even after decades of institutional failure and deliberate concealment. Daniel had not sought public attention, but he recognized that it came with the territory of standing beside Eleanor, and he accepted it as part of the cost of ensuring that her testimony received the credibility and attention it deserved, rather than being dismissed as the claims of a damaged woman seeking sympathy. 6 months after finding Anna in the woods, Daniel and Eleanor stood together near the edge of the Whitmore estate, which had been seized by federal authorities and was scheduled for sale, with proceeds designated for victim compensation. The property looked different without the family's presence. somehow smaller and less imposing, and Daniel felt no nostalgia for the years he had spent maintaining its grounds, understanding now that his work there had been part of a larger pattern of invisible people, serving wealthy families who hid monstrous secrets behind respectable facades. Eleanor asked if he ever wondered what his life might have looked like if she had never disappeared, if their family had remained intact, if the trajectory of his choices had not been shaped by her absence and the guilt he carried for failing to protect her. Daniel considered this question with the seriousness it deserved, and answered honestly that he could not imagine himself as someone other than who he was, that grief and loss had shaped him in ways both harmful and profound, but that he would not trade the person he had become if it meant erasing the reunion they had achieved and the relationship they were building. Eleanor nodded at this answer, understanding implicit in her expression, and she told him that she had spent years imagining what it would be like to find him again, to stand beside him as adults rather than the children they had been when she was stolen from their yard, and that the reality was both harder and better than her fantasies, because actual connection surpassed imagined reunion in ways that mattered more than she had anticipated. They stood in comfortable silence for a time, two people bound by blood and history and the shared experience of survival, and Daniel understood that the choice he had made to pursue truth rather than accept convenient explanations had rewritten everything, had transformed him from someone who avoided difficulty into someone who embraced the messy work of justice and refused to look away when looking away would have been easier. Eleanor reached into her pocket and pulled out the necklace, which authorities had returned once they no longer needed it as evidence, and she held it between them with the silver catching sunlight, and she asked if Daniel wanted it, if he wanted a physical reminder of what they had endured and overcome together. Daniel looked at the necklace for a long moment, at the initials that represented both the sister who had been stolen and the woman who had reclaimed herself through years of patient resistance, and he told Eleanor to keep it, that it belonged to her journey, not his, that he did not need objects to remember what they had survived together or to remind himself of the commitments he had made. Eleanor smiled and fastened the chain around her own neck, the pendant settling against her chest, where it had rested when she was 12 years old and still believed the world was fundamentally safe. And she said that maybe someday, when enough healing had occurred, she would give it to Anna, would pass it along to the next person who needed a symbol of hope and survival, and the possibility that broken things could find wholeness again.